Imagine being trapped in an isolated village where the snow doesn't just bring cold, but hides something much darker. In the midst of a brutal storm, you realize something is watching you, but it's not what you think. Every step in the snow, every sound in the wind is a sign that you're not alone. Something from the depths of the past is awakening. And the worst part, maybe you're the next to disappear. In this video, we will reveal the secrets that the snow tries to bury. But be careful, because what you're about to see could change everything you thought you knew about fear. Stay alert to every detail because nothing here is innocent. Don't forget to like and follow every second, because you won't want to miss the truth behind this story. Now tell me, would you face what's in the shadows? Or would you be consumed by the silence of the snow? Get ready for a suspense that will make you question how far fear can go.
The snow fell silently, like a mortal veil over the earth. Each flake, light and cold, settled gently, creating a white cloak that hid everything beneath it, as if the world were being erased, one trace at a time. The wind cut through the tall trees, howling and shaking their branches with fury, carrying with it a frozen scream. A loud reminder that something dark was hiding in that isolated place. It was an inhuman sound, as if nature itself were protesting against what was happening in the depths of that freezing night. The moon, which would normally illuminate the scene, was absent. The sky seemed heavier, swallowed by the impenetrable darkness. The lack of light made the landscape even more desolate, a canvas of shadows in which even thoughts got lost. The only visible presence was the veil of snow, falling relentlessly, silently, and mortally, as if time had frozen along with the earth. In the mountains, far from any trace of civilization, something moved. It wasn't the wind, nor the tremor of an animal. It was something else, something that shouldn't be there. A dark presence that slinked through the white mist, like a shadow that refused to conform to the nature around it. Its movements were cautious, yet calculated, and it seemed to be watching everything around it, as if waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. With each step, the snow piled up, but made no sound, as if it feared disturbing the heavy silence of the night. It was as if the very air had frozen in expectation, waiting for what would come next. Something ancient, something forgotten, but now awakening, silent and patient. And as the darkness swallowed everything, the presence watched from afar, waiting. The tourists had left early, even before the sun had set, hurried and nervous about the storms that were starting to intensify. The biting wind, laden with snow and ice, made it impossible to stay calm. The sky had darkened quickly, and black clouds gathered on the horizon, like omens of something evil about to unfold. With their eyes fixed on the distant mountains and their faces pale with fear, the visitors abandoned the village and disappeared into the snow-covered trails, leaving behind an uncomfortable emptiness. But amidst the collective panic, a small group of people still remained. They were few, perhaps 6 or 7, but their presence was intense, as if they were anchored to something much greater than mere curiosity. Something kept them there, something even they couldn't explain. As the storm raged around them, they found themselves drawn to the abandoned village, with its wooden houses decaying under the relentless weight of time. The broken windows, shattered doors, and roofs of some buildings collapsing. Everything seemed forgotten, as if the village itself had been swallowed by an invisible force. The snow fell relentlessly, but there, among the ruined houses, something else seemed to be happening. Something in the frozen particles covering the ground made the air feel thicker, denser. The group couldn't fully understand what was drawing them, but there was a feeling, a deep impulse guiding them. Their steps were hesitant, yet something pulled them toward that ruined place. Each one felt, in their own way, a growing unease, as if the village knew they were there, as if its abandoned and decayed houses were waiting for them. Some marks in the snow seemed to form patterns that couldn't be explained by the storm alone. They were curves, lines, almost imperceptible symbols, repeating and intertwining, leading them deeper into the deserted streets. Each wrinkle in the snow seemed to conceal something, something ancient and profound, something they, for some reason, were destined to find. But what could it be? Were they just echoes of a distant past, or something still alive, waiting patiently, waiting to be revealed? The sensation was indescribable. They were being watched, or perhaps guided. Each of them felt the weight of a secret about to unfold, but no one had the courage to ask exactly what was hidden beneath the thick layer of snow. Something, or someone, was calling them to that place. And as they moved forward, the feeling of being closer to something unnameable, became unbearable. The village was silent, but that silence seemed to encompass the entire universe. And yet, the houses continued to watch them, as if they knew more than they were willing to reveal. The first to notice the strange presence was Julio. As he stepped out of his cabin to gather firewood, the atmosphere felt different, as if the very air had changed. The wind, which usually cut into the skin with its icy breeze, now felt denser, heavier, as if it carried an invisible weight. The cold was no longer just a chill, but something deep, impenetrable, rooting itself in his bones. A shiver ran down his spine, raising the hairs on his body, as if the wind was not just cold but filled with something dark, something he couldn't comprehend. Julio looked around, trying to understand what was happening. It wasn't just the weather that bothered him. The village seemed to be in absolute silence, and that, in itself, was strange. The wind that used to howl between the trees was now mute. There were no sounds of animals, nor the usual rustling of leaves or the crackling of wood. Only the snow, silently accumulating on the ground and the rooftops, covered everything like a heavy white blanket. When he returned to the cabin, carrying the firewood, the door was open, but no one was speaking. The silence was suffocating. His eyes met those of the others, but no one dared say a word. They were all there, sitting or standing, motionless, with empty expressions and distant eyes. It wasn't fear, but a sense of alertness, as if each person was trying to comprehend what they couldn't see, but could feel. Something was wrong. The kind of wrong that cannot be explained, but is felt deep in the soul. Something hung in the air, invisible but present. A weight so intense that it seemed as though the village itself, with its weathered wooden cabins and deserted streets, was breathing differently, more slowly, more sluggishly. It was as if the earth beneath their feet was firmer, yet at the same time was giving way, as if some unknown force was testing them, challenging them. Julio felt the gaze of everyone on him. No one spoke, but everyone knew. Something was watching them. They could feel it, just as he could. That strange presence, that weight in the atmosphere. But no one dared name what was happening, and the silence, once comfortable and familiar, now felt like a prison. The words were stuck in their throats, not because they were lacking, but because they knew that any word could break the delicate balance that kept them in that state. The tension was palpable. Something was there, invisible, but with a presence as real as the winter that surrounded them. Something that waited, something that knew they were there. As time passed, the feeling of being watched intensified, like an invisible weight growing more and more present. The air, which had once seemed merely cold and biting, now had a palpable density, and each breath felt heavier. With every movement, the sense that something was there, watching, lurking from a distance, grew stronger. Sometimes, at the edge of their vision, something moved swiftly between the trees, gliding across the snow with a fluidity that seemed almost supernatural. It wasn't an animal, nor a natural sound of the forest, but something larger, older, camouflaging itself in the shadows of the night and the snow. The cold, which had once been just a characteristic of winter, now seemed to have a presence of its own. It grew stronger, deeper, as if it was no longer just a drop in temperature, but a force in itself, penetrating the bones, making everything heavier and more unsettling. The biting wind, which had once merely blown through the village, now seemed to have an intent, a will of its own. It slithered through the cracks of the cabins, knocked on the windows, whispered along the walls, and every breath it took was like a promise of something distant, yet imminent. It was as if the snow itself had come to life. The white mantle covering everything around them seemed to pulse, to breathe along with them. Each flake that fell was not just another piece of ice, but a fragment of a larger, older existence, as if winter itself had become a conscious being. It didn't just cover the land, it seemed to envelop the village, trapping the villagers in an unrelenting, frozen embrace. The silence among the members of the small group was thick, almost tangible. They looked at each other, but no one spoke. Fear was there, hidden in their eyes, but no one dared express it in words. Winter, with its unyielding presence, had already become an entity, something that seemed to wait, something that watched them with endless patience. No longer just a natural phenomenon, but a force with its own will, drawing them into its deadly embrace. And as the snow continued to fall, the outside world seemed to disappear, leaving only the sense that they were being swallowed by something much larger than themselves, something that couldn't be understood, but was there, waiting, watching, breathing alongside them. When the storm arrived, it wasn't like any other. The snow descended from the sky with an unrelenting force, as if winter itself were taking revenge for something forgotten. It wasn't a regular snowstorm with flakes falling slowly, but a thick and impenetrable curtain that erased all sound, swallowing the world around it. The wind, furious and sharp, tore through the air like razor blades, making the cold penetrate to the bone. The landscape that had once been familiar became unrecognizable, a white and murky mass, where even the simplest point of reference vanished under the icy mantle. But despite the chaos outside, the terror was not in the wind, nor in the snow piling up against the doors and windows of the cabin. It was inside the wooden walls that creaked under the weight of the storm. Something had changed, something that couldn't be explained, but which everyone felt with an agonizing clarity. The fire in the fireplace, which had once burned brightly, seemed to struggle to keep the flame alive, as if something invisible were draining its energy, and the air inside the cabin was denser, heavier, as if the very space had been altered by the storm outside. The members of the group exchanged silent glances. They didn't dare speak, but they knew. They knew they were not alone. Something was watching them. Something was waiting for them, patient, still, like a cold and distant presence, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. The fear was not in the shadows of the storm, but in the small sounds no one could identify. The faint creak of the floorboards, the distant crack of the walls, as if someone or something were moving between the tight spaces of the cabin. Each breath seemed louder than it should have been, each gust of wind against the windows more intense. The feeling was oppressive, as if invisible eyes were surrounding them, watching every movement, every breath, waiting. But whatever was there made no noise, did not reveal itself. It just was, like a distant shadow, but present, watching, waiting, like a presence that had long been part of that place. The storm outside roared with more force, but inside the cabin, time seemed to have stopped. Fear, with its icy tendrils, stretched across the room, coiling around the hearts and minds of everyone. And as the wind howled through the world outside, the terror grew, silently, in the spaces between the tight quarters. They couldn't escape, they couldn't hide, because whatever was watching them was there, with them, and the sense that something awaited them to take shape, something awakened by the fury of winter, made the air even heavier. The silence was absolute. Inside the cabin, nothing could be heard, not even the sound of the wind outside, which seemed to have been silenced by the storm itself. The walls, once welcoming and familiar, now seemed to swallow the sound, as if they wanted to keep everyone there, trapped, isolated from any outside world. Every movement, every sigh was muffled by the dense weight of silence, as if the very space had become an entity, alive and conscious, watching each of its inhabitants. The cold, which had once been limited to the exterior, now had no boundaries. It seeped through every crack, through every fissure in the wooden planks, penetrating the flesh and soul in a subtle but relentless way. It wasn't just a physical cold, but something deeper, a feeling of emptiness that made breathing harder and the heart heavier. The air seemed to have frozen, each breath becoming an effort, and the warmth from the fireplace, which had once been comforting, now seemed to be dissipating quickly, as if the house itself were being devoured by the chilling presence that invaded every corner. But the strangest thing of all wasn't the cold, nor the silence. The most unsettling thing was what was at the back of the house, in the shadows, where the light from the fire couldn't reach. Something moved there, something that couldn't be seen, but made its presence known with every breath. A subtle movement, almost imperceptible, but it was there, drawing everyone's attention. The air was heavier in that part of the house, as if the very atmosphere had distorted, becoming dense and unsettling. No one dared to get up to investigate. Each one, in some way, knew that it wasn't something to be confronted. The feeling of being watched, of being followed by invisible eyes, overtook even the bravest, freezing them in place. The house, with its tight walls and oppressive silence, held them there, like rats in a trap, with no way out, no words, just waiting for whatever was moving in the shadows. The cold, the silence, and the movement in the dark formed a macabre and invisible dance, something that couldn't be seen, but that everyone felt, touching the skin, the nerves, the mind. What was there? What moved in the shadows wasn't a tangible being, but a presence, a force that surrounded them, waiting, patiently, within those walls, swallowed by darkness. And as time passed, the feeling of entrapment became more and more unbearable. The first scream tore through the calm, breaking the silence that stretched through the house, heavy and dense like the snow falling outside. The woman, who was alone in the living room, quickly looked toward the window, alerted by the sudden explosion of panic in the air. Outside, among the snow-covered trees, something was moving. It wasn't an animal, nor a person. It was an indistinct white shape running with disconcerting speed, sliding between the trunks as if it were part of the storm itself. It was a shadow, but it had no defined form. A silhouette that seemed to dissolve as it moved forward, made of ice and shadow, an entity that didn't belong to this reality. She froze for a moment, her eyes fixed on the scene. Whatever it was, it seemed unreal, an ethereal presence that defied logic and understanding. The wind howled louder outside, as if the world itself were preparing for something that couldn't be explained. But the woman couldn't tear herself away from the window. Her fingers trembled as the palm of her hand touched the cold glass, as if something was calling her outside, to that frozen emptiness where the shape disappeared. Her heart beat fast, the words dying in her throat. Then, with a sudden movement, she stepped away from the window. But it wasn't her who made the decision. Something else pulled her, an invisible and relentless force, a cold current that dragged her away from the safety of the light, into the darkness, where the storm grew more intense. The surroundings around her distorted, as if the walls of the house were closing in, becoming tighter, more threatening. The sound of her scream, a scream of pure terror, echoed for a moment, but soon was swallowed by the storm. It was muffled by the roar of the wind, which seemed to devour any trace of life or resistance. Her scream dissolved, as if it had never existed, as if she had never been part of that world. The house, now silent again, seemed to still harbor the echo of her presence, but what remained of her was no longer human. The air was empty, as if all of it had been an illusion, a nightmare fading as time passed, leaving only the snow, the darkness, and the void. The others, now in panic, tried to group together, seeking the safety of proximity, but soon realized that the threat was not outside. It wasn't the storm, nor the biting cold that surrounded them. It was inside. Inside their minds, inside the very house, like an invisible virus spreading, eroding sanity with every passing second. The fear was no longer just an external sensation, but something that embedded itself deep within every thought, something that overtook their bodies and forced them to look at each other, suspicious and terrified. The shadows of the house no longer followed the light, as they should have. They twisted, stretched, and distorted in strange ways, as if they had a life of their own, as if the very dark corners of the house were rebelling against the logic of the space. Each candle, each flame in the fireplace, seemed to have its reflection distorted on the walls, creating ghostly shapes that danced and writhed grotesquely. But the most disturbing thing wasn't the shadows themselves, but what was hiding in them. Among these shadows, figures began to emerge. First, it was a face, a vague and blurry outline. But as it neared the light, it became more familiar. It was the face of one of the people present, distorted, deformed by an expression of pain and fear. Their eyes were empty, lifeless, as if the person's soul had been consumed, left behind. And then, more figures appeared, one after another. They weren't just shadows, but the very people who had been there, but their features were twisted, their mouths open in silent screams, and their bodies distant, as if the house had trapped them, forcing them to relive something they didn't even understand. Each figure seemed to crawl along the walls as if they were slinking in the shadows, trying to reach those who were watching, trying to touch them. The air grew denser, warmer, and the space tightened, as if the house was closing its claws around them. Whatever it was not a natural phenomenon. It was something older, something that had infiltrated their memories, their thoughts. The evil didn't come from the outside, but from within, from the depths of their own minds, feeding on their doubts, on their deepest fears. No one dared speak. Terror had paralyzed them, and the only sound that could be heard was the sound of their ragged breathing, struggling to maintain control as the distorted figures drew closer. The shadows were everywhere now, becoming clearer, more defined, as if they had shape, as if they were real. But the figures, with their familiar empty faces, watched them with eyes that didn't see, but seemed to see everything. The evil knew them, had seen them before, and now it was taking control, infiltrating each of them, seizing their memories, their emotions, their souls. The house, once a refuge, was now a prison, and the shadows, with their distorted smiles, were the only things left to watch them as terror consumed them. As the night dragged on, the feeling of claustrophobia overtook everyone, like a heavy blanket wrapping around them, squeezing them mercilessly. The village was distant, the storm outside cutting off any possibility of escape. But it was the isolation within the house itself that now consumed them. They were not only surrounded by the mountain, but also by each other, as if the cabin's walls, once welcoming, had turned into a prison. The silence between them was more deafening than the howling wind outside, and as time passed, the emotional distance became even more palpable, an invisible, impenetrable barrier. The terror, which before seemed to come from something visible, now fed on what they could not see, on what was beyond their reach, beyond what their eyes could comprehend. The shadows on the walls now were no longer just a product of the faint light from the fireplace, but something deeper, something that seemed to crawl, taking shape in the dimness, as if the very space distorted into a parallel reality to which no one had access. And then, as if the wind itself had become a messenger from the beyond, it brought voices, furtive and distant voices, whispering words that didn't belong to that night. They were murmurs from a forgotten past, from people who had disappeared long ago, as if the echoes of their presences, their interrupted lives, were still ingrained in the wooden walls of the house. It was as if the wind were the spokesman of ancient tragedies, telling stories that shouldn't have been heard, bringing to light what had been buried deep in the memory of the place. These voices were not clear, nor understandable, but with every word lost in the air, panic grew. The house seemed to breathe along with the wind, and the walls, which once seemed to protect them, now whispered secrets, secrets of death and despair. Something there was not right. Something in its history was unresolved, and these murmurs, these whispers from a distant time, were the key to a mystery no one wanted to uncover. They were no longer just prisoners of the storm. They were prisoners of the forgotten history of that mountain, of what had happened there, and of the lives that had never truly left. Fear spread like a disease, no longer from something visible, but from what hid in the shadows, from what they could neither understand nor control. And as the night wore on, the feeling that something was watching them, something waiting, only intensified. The wind howled louder and louder, carrying with it the murmurs of people who no longer belonged to that place, but whose souls still seemed trapped there, imprisoned in an endless cycle. The house now was no longer a refuge. It was a mausoleum of ancient secrets, and they were, inevitably, becoming part of that forgotten history. As time stagnated, the storm seemed endless. The snow continued to fall, uninterrupted, covering everything with its silent and relentless mantle. The wind howled louder and louder, but amidst the roar of the storm, there was something else. Something taking shape in the shadows of the cabin. The house, which had once seemed like a refuge, now became a cramped and suffocating space, where the air was heavy with an invisible yet palpable presence. The cabin was filled with presences, but no one dared move. Fear had frozen them in place, their bodies tense, eyes wide. They looked at each other, but no one spoke. The sound of breathing was the only noise heard, the frantic beating of anxious hearts. With each glance toward the shadows, with each movement at the edge of their vision, doubt settled in their minds. Was what they were seeing real, or was it a product of their minds, an illusion fueled by fear? The line between the tangible and the intangible blurred, and as the hours dragged on and the cold intensified, doubt turned into certainty. Something was there with them. Something was watching them. The presence seemed to grow within the cabin, infiltrating the darkest corners, spreading across the walls like a living shadow, as if it knew every thought, every feeling, every fear buried deep in the minds of those present. It wasn't a physical being, but its presence was impossible to ignore. Something without form, yet felt in every breath, in every silence. Something that knew their deepest fears, their vulnerabilities, their hidden weaknesses, and then, in an almost imperceptible movement, they all felt it. It was no longer a vague sensation, a passing shadow. It was as if invisible eyes were fixed on each of them, as if whatever was watching them knew more about them than they could ever imagine. The feeling of being studied, of being understood in a cruel and intimate way, took hold of each one. The anguish transformed into an unbearable pressure, as if the house itself were alive, absorbing their fears, feeding off them. No one dared move. Time seemed to stop, the minutes dragging on like an eternity, and the storm outside seemed to be just an extension of what was inside the cabin. Whatever was there with them was no longer a mystery. They knew enough to understand that they could not escape. Whatever was watching them would not allow it. And as the silence deepened, the certainty became inescapable. They were trapped, not by the storm, but by a much older and much more terrible presence, one that knew them and awaited them patiently in the shadows. With each passing minute, the ice spread throughout the house, not just in the air, but in the souls of everyone. The cold was no longer a mere physical sensation. It penetrated deeply, reaching places no one could imagine. The hands trembled, the lips were numb, but the worst was not the cold itself. The worst was the feeling that something far more insidious was taking control of everything. The air felt dense, heavy, as if it were frozen, and even the candlelight became weak and unstable, struggling to keep its flame alive. The clock, which had once marked every second with precision, was now stopped. The ticking sound that had previously filled the space with a sense of normalcy had faded, leaving behind a profound and oppressive silence. Time seemed to have been captured by the storm, as if it had the power to stop the very flow of reality. Nothing seemed to follow the natural order of things. The outside world, covered in snow and darkness, merged with the interior of the cabin, and the sensation that time wasn't passing, that they were trapped in some kind of eternal suspension, grew stronger with every passing moment. The only thing that moved was the wind. It howled outside, a sound so penetrating and sharp it seemed to tear the very guts from the earth. But it wasn't just the sound of the wind that disturbed them. It was the feeling that the wind was calling, as if it were trying to invite something, or someone, into the house. It wasn't natural. The wind seemed alive, with its own intention, a force striving to infiltrate, to root itself here, in this space now filled with a growing terror. In the shadows, something waited for the right moment. It wasn't visible, but it could be felt. It was there, at the edges of vision, moving subtly, as if it were studying every movement, every breath of those present. The house, which had once been a refuge, now seemed to be nothing but a trap. The shadows didn't behave as they should. They stretched and twisted in strange ways, slowly approaching the people, but never touching them. It was as if something, or someone, was waiting, patiently, waiting for the moment when resistance would break and the last hope would fade. Fear had become a solid presence, as dense as the frozen air. Hearts beat faster, breaths grew heavier, but nothing could be done. They were paralyzed, trapped in that space, as if the very ice had frozen their souls. Whatever was out there, whatever the call of the wind was no longer just waiting outside. It was inside, in the shadows, waiting, always waiting, until the right moment came for it to reveal itself. When dawn finally arrived, or what should have been dawn, the village was unrecognizable. The sky, a pale blotch, stretched across the lifeless landscape, as if the sun itself had hesitated to rise, unable to illuminate what remained. The houses, once full of life and warmth, had vanished, as if they had never existed. Where once there had been wooden rooftops covered in snow, there was now only emptiness, an expanse of untouched snow, smooth like a blank sheet, waiting for something, for someone. The trees, which had once formed a thick protective line around the village, were broken, their branches scattered across the ground like the broken bones of a dead creature. The paths that had once separated the houses were now covered, buried under layers of snow, as if time itself had erased them, taking everything with it. The village, with its small huts and simple life, seemed to have been consumed by the storm, erased from existence, as if it had never truly existed. Everything was empty, devoid of life, with no trace of those who had lived there. The group, now scattered, was lost. Each one walked in different directions, as if they had been pushed away from one another, guided by an invisible force. Their steps were heavy, each movement a struggle against the weight of the snow. But the worst was not the cold or the exhaustion. The worst was the feeling of being trapped, unsure if they were still alive, or if the evil of the snow had consumed them. The air was dense, the sound muffled, and with every breath it felt as though something was watching them, something that did not belong to that reality, something that still inhabited the place, waiting patiently. They were now between the real and the unreal, between what they remembered and what they saw, and that thin line seemed to disappear with every step they took. They wondered if what they had lived was real or an illusion created by the mind, if what surrounded them was reality or an endless nightmare. Whatever it was, something was wrong. Something deeply wrong in the way the world around them seemed to transform, as if the evil that had infiltrated the snow, the shadows, had left its indelible mark. They were trapped in a limbo, where the answer didn't come and time didn't pass. All that remained was a field of snow, pristine and endless, and the emptiness that swallowed everything. The only thing they knew for sure was that they were alone. Alone in the silence, alone in the emptiness, alone in the mystery of a place that no longer existed or had never existed. And as they walked, they felt as though they were being watched, as if the snow, the village, the very air had become a prison that trapped them, making them wonder. Were they the last souls to wander that place? Or had the evil that had consumed them found new ways to feed, spreading beyond the mountains in search of others to devour? The snow, as always, covered everything. It was a silent and unchanging mantle, seeming to swallow the world around it, leaving it lifeless, colorless, as if time itself had slowed down, or perhaps been interrupted. But there was something more there, something beyond the frozen landscape, something that couldn't be seen, but was felt in every gust of wind, in every flake falling from the sky. Something that waited patiently, as if winter were its home, a place where it could rest, dormant, waiting for the right moment to awaken. This something was not merely a force of nature. It wasn't the fury of the wind or the coldness of the ice. It was something older, something that had remained in the shadows for centuries, watching, waiting, feeding off the stillness and solitude. Perhaps it was an entity, a presence from a distant time, one that had walked that land before the world was covered by snow, before the very concept of time faded under the immortal cold. Something that had been forgotten by generations, but that, somewhere deep, knew that its return was inevitable. As the wind hissed through the remnants of a world that no longer existed, a new storm began to form. The air grew dense, as if the very atmosphere were charged with palpable tension, as if the wind, which once seemed a simple manifestation of the weather, was now carrying something heavier, something deeper, something that didn't just come from the mountains, but from a place far deeper, much more distant. The storm wasn't just a change in the weather, but a manifestation of what was about to happen, of what was about to return. And as the snow piled up, covering the traces of everything that had once existed, a sense of imminent destruction hung in the air. Another storm was approaching, stronger, faster, darker. Perhaps it would be the last, perhaps not. But one thing was certain. It would not come only to cover the earth with more snow. It would bring something even darker with it, something that would awaken what had been buried, something that would feed on the darkness and stillness of winter with an insatiable hunger. The wind grew stronger, as if calling the entity that had been waiting patiently into its fury, and the storm intensified. The snow now was no longer just a frozen covering, but a prison, a barrier between what was alive and what had been forgotten. Something was about to emerge from the depths, something that had waited a long time to return. And when the final gust of wind cut across the horizon, everyone knew that what was coming would not only bring an end to the stillness, it would bring the end of everything. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this mystery, share it with friends so they can uncover what's hidden in the shadows of the snow. Don't miss the next video that will appear on the screen. More suspense and revelations await. Let's explore what fear can hide together.